supposed to. In the 1960s, there was a series of cases that came out that basically said, we're not going to allow official prayer in schools. And then ultimately in the 80s, there's a case in 1985 called Wallace, which said, we're also not going to allow moments of silence if those moments of silence are just a way to get prayer into schools. And so that sort of leads us up to 2022 and Kennedy. And what happens? Well, a coach up in Washington State decides that after every game, he's going to walk to the 50-yard line and kneel down and start to pray. And he does. And a whole bunch of students and staff from the school follow him, and they all start praying, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. The school steps in, and the school says that's not allowed under the Establishment Clause. That is, Congress shall make no law establishing religion. That law also applies to the states, by the way, now, because of this concept known as a corporation. States have to follow it as well. That happened in the 40s. But in any event, he kneels down, starts praying, and they say, you can't do that. Now, we'll give you another place to go do it, but you can't do it on the 50-yard line of the football field. Kennedy says, I'm still going to do it. More and more students start to join, and ultimately he loses his job and sues. He goes to the Supreme Court, and he wins. The Supreme Court says the free exercise clause, that is, his right to practice his religion, gives him the right to do that, and that he's not compelling anyone else on the other side who wouldn't want to pray or feels like their prayer is being forced upon them. It's not going to force them to do that. So that's what led us to say we need to have a discussion about this. Basically, what we're asking is what a lot of politicians are asking in this midterm election. And that is, I've heard it already several times. Heard it the other night in the debates that we sponsored. What's that? Well, some politicians are saying the problem with the country is we need to get prayer back into schools. They're going all the way back to those 1960s cases and saying those were decided wrongly. And that this Kennedy case that's sort of changing things up, that's necessary. People on the other side are saying, no, you're blurring the lines between church and state, and that there should be a wall of separation between the two, and that that's what the Establishment Clause means. So that is about the simplest way to sort of summarize this little debate that we're going to have. And so I am joined today, thankfully, by Ben Johnson and by Madison Jackson. They're both the events coordinators for the Institute of Politics, and they're going to kind of help lead this discussion. And basically what we want you to do is we want you to be able to say anything that you feel freely. So we're going to respect each other, maintain civility, do all those kinds of things, and we're going to try to see if we can figure out some things, come to some conclusions. Okay? So I'm going to turn it over to them, and they're going to see if we can get some brave souls to sort of join us up here, and then we'll start to sort of unfold this conversation.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, for coming. The first thing we're going to ask, is there anyone that feels like they strongly agree or they agree that we should have prayer in school? Is there anyone here in the audience that would be willing to take that position or argue that position if you don't agree with it? What about someone that strongly disagrees, that thinks, hey, there should not be any prayer in school, that there should be a complete separation? Is there anyone willing to do that? So, do you want to set up this here? Which one of you guys would like to go?
Yeah, go for it.
Sweet, yeah, if you just want to take the chair.
And then we're also looking, I can talk about it. We're also looking for someone that is undecided. So if you just don't really know, you want to learn some more about it, then would you like to do that?
What if you kind of have ambiguous opinions about both?
I feel like that is a fair spot to take in the middle, and then you can kind of decide where you lean and if that's what you're looking for. So yeah, we can appreciate your opinions.
Sure.
Yeah. You want to take a seat in the middle?
I can argue with later.
In favor? That'd be awesome. Thank you.
Sweet. Thank you guys for coming up here. So what we'd like is we'd like all of you to kind of introduce yourselves. We'll start on this side and move this way, and then just kind of state your name and your opinion and why you held that opinion, or the position you're representing.
Hi, my name is Brianna Bell. I would say I hold the opinion because I believe that as many people as possible should get an education, and if we start making them areas that are divided by religion or by anything else, that will threaten that ability for people, and I think that's something that should be avoided pretty much completely.
My name is Steven, and I don't think that the issue is quite as black and white as yes or no. I think that there are a lot of different factors that determine whether or not it should be allowed or disallowed, and I'll get into that in a bit.
Hi, I'm Egan, and I don't necessarily agree with the stance that I'm going to be arguing for, but I think I'm going to be able to do a good job. I think, well, the person I'm being right now thinks that even schools sponsored by the state aren't pretending that it's necessary. And even if it is going to be enforced, I think that, you can always choose a different school. That's not required. And to a degree, this nation has always been a Christian nation. I don't think that needs to change.
Okay, I have to disagree with that though. A lot of public schools allow students to attend their school based on the neighborhood or district that they live in. They don't often have a choice to go to a different school. Smaller towns only have one. And if you disagree with the decisions of that school, are you supposed to pick up your whole family and move to a completely different town?
So, I am going to retract my statement about the Christian nation and take a little bit of a different stance. I think that all religions should be allowed to pray in schools. Muslim, Jewish, pagan, to a degree. I think that if everyone has the opportunity to pray, whether you're religious or you don't believe in a religion, you don't have to participate. And if they're having a sponsored prayer moment, then even if the person leading the prayer might be Christian, the people who aren't could have their own prayer in a different area or in the same area. And I don't think that infringes on anyone's ability to get an education. And I also don't think that would make people need to choose different schools.
Let's stop right there, because I think this would be a good chance for someone in the audience, because what you're doing is you're saying we're just not going to discriminate amongst religions, or your right to, under the First Amendment, to freely practice religion also means you have a right to practice no religion. So who's sort of finding themselves kind of saying, well, maybe that's the ground that we go on. Not that we're going to have a officially state-sponsored religion or sponsored prayer, but that we're just going to allow everyone to sort of do their own thing. Yeah? All right. Tell me why. Why is that okay?
I think it just gives everybody the opportunity to kind of just be equal in a sense. It's just everybody has equal opportunity. We're not just choosing one specific religion that is only allowed in school. It's kind of just everybody, even people practice religion. If that makes sense.
Yeah, so what if you had someone put up a nativity scene? I saw this in San Francisco when I lived there. They allowed for a nativity scene to put up, but they said, we're going to be fair to everyone. And so they said, okay, so if you're Jewish, if you're Muslim, everyone gets to put up something around basically Christmas time. If you're atheist, you can do that. The satanic religion came in and they said, we're putting something up. The Pastafarians came in. Which believes in this grand pasta monster as a god. They put something in, and it literally filled the entire city hall with that sort of thing. Are you still okay with that? Yeah, San Francisco. Right? Yeah.
Well, yeah. I think just in that setting, I think it's a little different than school. I think that just in an academic setting, at least like to take a moment for prayer. I think that anybody can just, quickly, bow their head or anything like that. But with the nativity scene, I think that's like a strictly religious or simply a holiday season where anyone can go in, and it kind of separates from kind of an academic perspective where it's, I think there's a bit of difference.
You guys see the difference up there? Yeah, Bree?
Yeah, to sort of expand on that point, I think that of course, every individual is allowed to do what they want privately, but to expand on the nativity scene point, I think he's on the right track that it's an issue of shared space and kind of, obviously also in groups you're allowed to do what you want, but if it is so public and in such a shared space, you're kind of inviting other people into it implicitly.
Like in kind of a non-religious, free religious.
Yes, most schools, I don't think it's controversial to say could be considered shared public spaces unless you are going to a Catholic school or to a Baptist school, which, to emphasize, do exist. A lot of people go to them.
Well, and I would like to expand on that. That brings up a really good point about the difference between private schools and public schools. I mean, do we enact laws that inhibit people's religion in public schools and expand those restrictions on private schools as well? Where's the line drawn?
So I'd like to bring up another point for you guys to consider. I don't think this is on, so I'm just going to talk loud. What about having just a moment of silence? You're not assigning it to any specific religion, but instead you are just holding a space. And then maybe even consider on top of that if it is led by a student rather than a teacher, and where that place is. Stephen?
Why? What is the purpose? What is the point? Yes, prayer, contemplation, religion, all can be wonderful things, but time and place, I think, is important here. Is there a point or purpose or a productive result from that? There are 24 hours in the day. You're only spending about 4 to 5 of them in school. Why is that the place?
Okay, Bree, do you have something to add to that?
Yeah, I was going to add, I think that also inherently, as someone who is not very religious, that would be an uncomfortable environment to be in. Expecting everyone in the room to be religious and to need that is in its own way possibly pushing religion onto some of those people.
Do you think just a blank moment of silence is inherently religious?
What is the purpose of it beyond being religious is, I think, the inherent point there. You could have a moment of, I think the purpose would have to be very clearly stated if it was not religious.
Otherwise, you're just wasting a moment of time that could be better used studying.
We have a couple comments about this in the audience.
Well, what's being protected under the constitutional amendment? Is it the government forcing you to practice a religion, or is it the government just involving itself in religion? What is the protection being centered on? Because what the Supreme Court ruled on was the school interfering with a private decision that coach made. He wasn't telling his players to come with him. He wasn't telling them to follow him in midfield. So what is that constitutional amendment even protecting?
He had a right to go pray. He did, but what he was doing was he was making a public statement on public university property. He wasn't praying in his own home or praying. He was going out there and praying on a football field in front of all his students and making a public statement. He wasn't bringing religion into his own private. He was doing something on someone else's property, like someone else. It's not necessarily the same thing.
I would like to say I agree with that. I feel like even at a football game at your school, if you want to take a knee and say a prayer and ask that your team plays well and performs well, you can do that. But I agree with you. It was more the manner in which he did it. He didn't, he wasn't by the bleachers. He wasn't in an area where he was not obvious. He went deliberately to center stage, if you will, and did it in front of everyone.
I can tell you a little bit about the case too. The school said, we'll make an accommodation for you elsewhere, but that because it's going to appear as if the school is compelling the students to join in on this activity, and the Supreme Court disagreed and said, no, it's not. It's his free exercise of religion. So that's kind of how it broke down. And that's typically what had happened up until this case, which was the government has to make public accommodations for people's religious practice. But if it looks like it's endorsing religion in any way, then that violates the Establishment Clause until this case.
Okay. Do you have a comment as well?
This was kind of jumping back to the moment of silence argument. You brought up just like, what's the point if not to pray? And my high school in 2017, if you'll remember, during the Texas shooting where 17 students were killed, we held a 10-minute moment or I believe it was actually 17 moment of silence, a minute for each student. And aside from prayer, the purpose that we held, I'm religious, but I didn't pray in that time, was just to contemplate and show respect towards those students. And I can see how obviously when people bow their head and they don't talk, it can give the appearance of prayer, but it aside from prayer, it can give just a moment to contemplate and show respect to those people.
Bree, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, I just want to be clear that those happen for tragedies often, and I was not referring to those at all. Those make more sense to me personally because they are a clearly stated purpose because they're more an environment for grief.
Oh, yes.
Yes, and if it's a moment of silence to like put aside for just, like, oh, this is our moment of silence, but it's just like a prayer moment, then those I think are very obviously religious, but
no.
Yeah.
I also think you have a good point in bringing that up because that is a important line to draw. So
I think the thoughts, like in moments of tragedy, I think those moments of silence should be used whereas, okay, we're going to take 10 minutes to just pray and not pray. I think those are kind of very religious and should be encouraged as well.
Yeah.
So what I'm kind of hearing from this is a consensus that if the moment of silence happens after a moment of grief, it's going to change the narrative of what that moment of silence is meant for versus one that happens every morning at 8 a.m. when you walk through the schoolhouse gates. Is that what I'm getting from you guys?
I think so. For me, yes.
Yes.
To play a little bit of devil's advocate here, just to try to balance it back out or just to try to get another perspective in here, is do you think if you do a non-denominational moment of silence, right, in the sense of like, hey, we're encouraging people to just, connect how they wish to connect or whatever, do you feel there is a difference in that pressure versus saying, hey, we're not going to do anything, is if there's a pressure, equal pressure exerted in that way to encourage people not to be religious, if that makes sense. So I was kind of phrased weird. I can rephrase it if you like.
Yeah, can you rephrase the question?
So it's been stated that there's kind of a pressure if there's a moment of silence to encourage people to be religious, saying, hey, like we're pushing religion kind of onto you because if you choose not to be, then you're, or it could appear that way. Do you feel that there's an equal pressure or can be an equal pressure if we just negate it altogether to encourage people not to be religious, to not show their practices, to not stand out?
I'd like to think about that for a second.
Or even if you have a response to that as well as kind of taking that pro stance.
I think to start off,
You're doing great.
thank you. I promise I'm doing my best. I lost my thought. This is so frustrating.
I can.
Okay, I remembered. I think that to a degree, first of all, individuals like who aren't religious, atheists, or whatever anybody would like to call themselves, feeling like something that isn't explicitly religious is making them uncomfortable is not what the law is put in place to protect. Anybody can feel uncomfortable for any reason, and there isn't any job for the law to make things that make people a little bit uncomfortable illegal. And second of all, with what you're saying, encouraging non-religion, I think if we use like Muslim students for an example, they are like based on their religion, they are instructed to pray facing Mecca however many times a day, right? And because that time is explicitly allotted to them based on like what we've been talking about and allowing an area or whatever, I think that disallowing other religions from having moments can be showing preference, and the point is to not do that.
All right.
Egan, there's a community just outside of Detroit that is majority Muslim, majority Islam. In a public school in that community, what if they had 5 moments of silence? In other words, they say it's just a moment of silence, but we're going to do it 5 times every day, because that's typically what members of Islam are required to do, is pray 5 times to Mecca. Does that change it at all?
I think as long as the school schedule is set up in a way that doesn't take away from school time, like if that area is majority Muslim, I'm sure the majority of people would be okay with having maybe half an hour longer school day to allot for those times. And I don't think that should be disallowed based on the type of area that it is. And the students who aren't Muslim, you can use that time to study. Like, it doesn't take away from anything, I think.
See, I think that's the question we have about our rights. Who are we protecting? Do we really need to protect popular speech? Typically, when we think about the First Amendment and freedom of speech, we think about protecting unpopular speech because it's unpopular. Popular speech doesn't usually need a lot of protection. And so the question is trying to get to, well, what if you weren't Muslim and you were in that community? That's clearly designed for 5 prayers in a day. And is that infringing on the rights of the minority religion or no religion in that? I think that's the purpose of that question. Yeah, I think you answered it well.
Bree, do you have a comment?
Yes, both Vince and you touched on what I was going to originally say, but to go back to your question about being pressured out of showing your religious affiliation or whatnot, I think in a school, in this pretend school that we've constructed in our collective imagination that has this moment of silence, it is already going to be majority religious. And I think in these communities where this is a question and this is a problem, it is already going to be a majority religious community, essentially. That's not an extremely strong answer. And Vince pretty much touched on what I was going to say about the minority religious group in a hypothetical area needing to be considered. That's not super clear, but there you go.
But with the idea of a majority and a minority, demographics are changing. Religion is falling quite out of favor with the younger generation. So does that change any of these thought processes of protecting minority or majority speech now that we're having shifting demographics away from a religious minority or to more of a religious minority versus?
I mean, I would like to reiterate what I said first about somebody being completely free to express what they need to in private and to pray in private. I strongly believe that that should never be infringed and that there should be protections in place for that student being abused or assaulted based on doing that. And of course, I assume that has happened before in, say, a Muslim student in a Baptist community potentially being harassed for doing the prayer that they need to in private.
We have a comment from the audience as well.
Going back to that school thing, I don't believe that there should be like specific 5 minutes or 5 different separate times of silence, because that's a government institution going out of their way to make exceptions for religion. I don't think that that should be the case in any sense. I don't think that I think if the students wanted to, they're more than welcome to step out and go do that, but they shouldn't have a dedicated, they should be able to step out and go do it by themselves, but like people who are not religious shouldn't be having to go through that 5 minutes of silence as well, or those 5 times of silence as well, just because they're not religious and it's not their religion, and they shouldn't have to be practicing it. Those people that want to can step out and leave and go do it themselves.
But see, then the religious argue, well, now we're being ostracized. Now we're being forced to do something that the majority doesn't have to do.
But you're not. It's your choice to go leave if you want to leave or not. It's not.
That's what the Constitution protects. Hold on. Yeah, we keep switching the narrative here. I mean, the Constitution says Congress shall enact no law that infringes on the free exercise of religion. You keep saying that we can exercise and say what we want, do what we want in private, but that's not what's there to protect then if I'm doing it in private. So from what you guys are saying, and I'm a staff member here, if I were to pray here for my dinner or lunch, that you'd feel uncomfortable with that. So I don't see the difference. That's what it's supposed to. That's what the Constitution, the First Amendment, is supposed to protect. Is my ability to pray right here in public, in a public place.
But there's also the other part of the First Amendment, the Establishment Clause. So you said you're a staff member here, and you are, and faculty. So if you were to lead a prayer at the beginning of your class, of course, that wouldn't be allowed, right? So I think the goal is to try to find what's the middle ground then. No one, I don't think there's even the most liberal Supreme Court justice that's going to say that the public accommodations or the religious accommodations part of the free exercise clause should be done away with. I don't think there's not a case that even hints at that. In other words, if you want to pray while you're having dinner or having lunch on campus, you're allowed to do that.
No, but I've seen people push back on that and find that offensive. I mean, even here in Utah, by birth, I'm a Jew. And so growing up, we got out of school early, a week earlier than our Christian friends for Christmas. We got out a week early for Hanukkah, and nobody batted an eye. It's just what we did. It was just accepted. Nobody said anything about it. If the Muslims wanted to leave whenever they needed to leave, then they did. But nobody was saying you can only do it in the confines of the closet here at the school or whatever. You know what I mean? I think that's a real slippery slope. Then you're telling me you are limiting what I can and can't do.
But would you agree then that you're allowed to do what you can do, but not in your official capacity? That's what this case sort of brings up, this Kennedy case, because what they're saying is he's a coach. yeah, no one's compelled to go onto the field to pray, but they all feel like they should. And there's a pressure. In fact, one of the other coaches said he was being yelled at by parents and students saying, why aren't you going down there? You know, that sort of thing. That's where we're trying to find
No,
alignment.
and I see the distinction, but like if I pray for in whatever capacity as a Utah Tech faculty or staff member, I'm not telling my students they need to do it. I don't think anybody here has cajoled anybody or forced anybody to pray. But that's not where our conversation keeps going. It keeps going back to, well, what you do in private is your own business. We're talking about protecting what we can do in public.
Yeah. Let's go around here. Yeah. And then up to you. Yeah. Yeah, Bree.
I'll go first. I like parts of the point that he's bringing up, and I appreciate the opportunity to say that I am not against certain accommodations being given to students for their religious needs, like what you're bringing up about Hanukkah and being let out a week early for Hanukkah. I don't personally find that problematic at all. I don't think that puts the onus on any other students. I think to use that example to help draw the line would be being in, say, a majority Jewish school and having a whole school, I can't figure out the word.
Menorahs? Menorahs displayed, everywhere.
Yeah.
Kind of thing.
Yeah, that sort of thing. And having religious services that are school sanctioned, to reiterate, at a public and not private institution.
Well, I would also like to say that I agree that if you want to choose to express yourself religiously in public, you should be allowed to do that. But as I said at the beginning, I mean, it's not black and white. It's not yes you can, no you can't. It's time and place. What are the circumstances of the situation that you're in? If I am a college professor teaching a class on whatever, pick your class, and I stop the class that these students have paid this institution for, and I tell them, give me 5 minutes, and I walk out of the room and I pray for 5 minutes and I come back in. Well, sure, I am exercising my right to express my religion freely, but I am now infringing on these students' time. So I think it's important to remember that we do have the right to express ourselves, but I think that we need to be aware of whether or not that expression in certain situations and circumstances can infringe on other people.
Egan?
I like you guys. I'm having a good time. Anyway, so let's say you're a Muslim student and the school hasn't given you like extra 5 minutes every five times a day. That hasn't happened. Do you think that because of your prayer, because of your religion and what you're doing to respect your religion, you are losing some academic progress because you have to leave classes and the rest of the students get to keep learning the material, but you have to go? You can't keep learning. You have to take away that amount of time in your day to practice your religion. But if you're choosing to make students practice their religion and leave the classroom while the other students continue to learn, then I think that is taking the freedom from religion a little bit too far.
He has to leave, but I would suspect Professor Owens would probably be comfortable with that line, wouldn't you? In other words, if you were to stop class for 20 minutes at the beginning of every one of your courses for a moment of silence, and then
Or so I can go out and pray.
yeah,
Well, I don't know. I mean, how about I got a 70%?
You got an answer to that?
Go ahead.
Absolutely. I think that's a matter of private contract law, right? Employment law.
he's freely entered into a contract to teach here at Dixie Tech. Sorry, I'm from the old school, Utah Tech. I think his employer has the right to say, we don't want you to do that while you're employed here. And he has voluntarily entered that arrangement. That should not be a matter of constitutional law. That's a matter of employment and contract law. And I also just had a comment, yes, for Professor who's leaving, but that's okay. It'll be for everyone. He brought up the point that, I shouldn't have to go into a broom closet to pray. And I think that was kind of just a miss. I think that was that might have been me, but I don't think that's what anyone wants. I think, like I said before, you should be able to, in a public area, you should be able to silently pray by yourself. But it's a difference of, if it's a Christian prayer, bowing your head versus, hey, can we take 5? And then center stage, say your prayer, come back. It's two different things to have a very public, everyone needs to accommodate to me versus I just need to silently pray.
To touch on what Egan said before about an individual student losing academic time, I think that is a good place to touch on. There's a lot of, I think we can slip into hypotheticals a lot with this conversation. And I think, again, I am in favor of accommodations being given in that situation. And I think it is more than possible for said accommodations to be given in that situation. And I think that's an element of this that needs to be dealt with on a case by case basis. And we can't just overarching, everyone has to be involved because one student, that one student needs to fight for those accommodations because they should be given, and they have a right to have those accommodations be given to them to protect their exercise, which is important, and which is, of course, what the Satanists putting up the statue and the Pastafarians putting up the statue, I think would agree with me that that individual student deserves to have the right to freely exercise their religion.
So, going back to the constitutional protections, that there shall be no laws that infringe upon one's religion or touch on one's religion, right? But you also have the right to express your religion freely. Going to what you said about students losing academic time, religion is a choice. It's not a requirement, it's a choice. It is something that you freely choose to do. And if you choose to take the time that you need to pray in the middle of a class, whether it's the time that you are supposed to in accordance to your religion, or whether that's just the time you chose to do it, you are making that choice to do so. But it is not the government's place to make any laws that restructure the education system to fit around those preferences, those times. So if you choose to step outside of class and say prayer, you can do that. You should not be punished, or you should not be made fun of or mistreated for that decision. But you need to know that it's a decision that you made. And if you miss out on some of the things that are being spoken about in class, then you miss out on some of the things that are being spoken about in class. It's not the government's place to restructure the education system to fit around your prayer time.
Well, and we have, you were asking about hypotheticals, and we have so many other situations where this fits into, right? People try to put up 10 commandments in front of courthouses. Students say, I don't want to say the Pledge of Allegiance because it has under God. Our national motto is in God we trust. Right? And so a lot of these issues sort of get confusing for a lot of people because they're like, well, where are we going to draw the line? And I wish I could tell you that there is this bright line, and particularly after this case, there isn't as bright of a line as there used to be. So what about a few of those kind of additional examples getting outside of school prayer?
I mean, there was a girl in my elementary school that didn't say the Pledge of Allegiance because she was Jehovah's Witness, and I'm glad that that wasn't. I don't think that should be formalized. I don't think they should be forced to do that in any way, shape, or form. As for the motto, I think that is an interesting place to take the conversation because I think it is in part an acknowledgement. This is tricky. This is tricky to phrase. An acknowledgement that our history is very heavily Christian. But I think it is one of the most powerful things about this country that we can incorporate other people and other, creeds and religions into, melting pot, Ellis Island, people coming in. And I think having that melting pot makes us better than we were before. And I think there is a balance that can be drawn between acknowledging that history and acknowledging a very heavily Christian base while also improving on that base and making it more possible to be more open and more, got to bring up the word diverse.
Egan, did you want to respond to that? What do you think? 10 Commandments in front of the courthouse, under God in the Pledge of Allegiance, in God we trust as a motto, on the money. A lot of that actually came in during the Cold War. People would be surprised to learn. But what do you think? Draw a different line?
Fun fact, I already knew about the Cold War thing. I just like bragging. I like feeling smart. Okay. I think partially in the name of tradition, much fewer people have been harmed by having those letters very small on the paper that we hold in our pockets. Not all of us, some of us don't have money, but then the people who have either been apathetic toward it or felt acknowledged based on that. And I don't know why I can't remember anything today. Okay. So if anyone else feels like they can argue this position better, I'm ready to get off the stage. If anyone wants to. But I'm also fine being here. I think that having the 10 Commandments in front of the courthouse, I can't, in my head, find a good reason for that to happen, but I know I'm supposed to argue that position.
Well, I can tell you what some people say that argue on that side. The argument that wins the most is, well, they were already there. Okay, the 10 Commandments were already there. So when they try to put in a new set of 10 Commandments, it's usually disallowed, right? Or it's always disallowed. But when they say, well, wait a minute, that was put in 150 years ago or 175 years ago, something like that, it should be allowed to stay because what we're talking about is basic general moral principles. That's what they argue. I'm not arguing it, but that's what they argue.
I didn't know that, in this situation, they had already been there for a long time. That makes it a lot easier to argue.
It's both situations. So, for example, in the Supreme Court, there's a copy of the 10 Commandments, but they tried to put a set of 10 Commandments in front of a courthouse in Austin, struck down. You see this a lot with crosses, crosses to memorialize war. Well, if they were there from a long time ago, now it's just a part of history. But if you try to put them in today, it's a violation of the Establishment Clause. Does that help?
Yeah, so I think that if something that has been in a town for a long time is starting to get weathered, if it's a cross or 10 Commandments on the court, first of all, if it's allowed to be in the Supreme Court, which should be the model for all the courts in the nation, that's supposed to be the highest place of authority, and who are we if not trying to be better and be more like the best of us, then why shouldn't that be allowed in other courthouses? I think if it is not allowed in other courthouses, then it shouldn't be allowed in the Supreme Court. And I just think that's a double standard. And with the crosses memorializing war, for example, if it is a weathered statue, it has been damaged over time, and people in the city are saying that it should be, as a monument, replaced for respect of what it originally stood for, as well as beautifying this town continually, because that's an important part. You need to enjoy where you live. I think replacing something that has already been there should be allowed, and the Supreme Court, having the Ten Commandments, should allow other courts to have them as well.
Would any of you be surprised to know that, for example, the Senate begins each one of its sessions with a prayer? Did you know that?
I knew.
And they
I knew
bring
that.
in people from different religious denominations to do it each time. A lot of people are shocked by that.
Yes.
Hi, well, just to comment on that real quick, you're going to see a lot of pictures of politicians in church the next 2 weeks. So, with the midterms coming up, I'm going to just say, when I was in Seattle, I got laid off from a very good job, and I decided to go take a semester at South Seattle Community College, computer and typing, retraining, and it was an all-day Monday through Thursday class. At noon each day, there was a group of Muslim students who had their prayer rugs, and right in the hallway did their prayers, and no one said a word. It was not a problem at all. I can pretty much guarantee you, if you had a group of students in the middle of the hallway kneeling and saying the Lord's Prayer or something, there would have been a problem. But that's here or there. What I don't understand, this coach, what was it, after the games, he goes out in the middle of the field and kneels to pray?
Yeah.
And then others can join him where they can't?
So the school said, no, you can't. That's the property of the school. What you're doing is, as a staff member of the school, is you're essentially leading a prayer, which is unconstitutional. So they fired him because he refused to stop.
Right.
And then the Supreme Court said, no, he's allowed to do that.
Right, but he wasn't requiring anybody to follow him.
No.
How's that different than gathering for a fallen player who's being carted off or may have a neck injury or head injury? They generally kneel and pray for the player.
I think that the difference with the courts look at it is that would be an act of spontaneity, not being directed by the school to do it, right? In other words, the school isn't saying, every time someone gets carted off or whatever, make sure that you go out and pray around them, that sort of thing.
Okay.
It's the degree to which it's the influence of the staff member.
Yeah, and I don't know where this is at. I mean, would they have the same policy if they had players kneeling in protest?
No, I don't think they would. Actually, I don't think that the school would object to that, if that's what you're asking.
Well, isn't that hypocritical?
I think they would argue it's because those students aren't in the position of authority. They're expressing themselves, but they're not. It's not by their very actions are they leading the other students in a position of power that represents the school. It's a hard line to draw. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, we had that with the football players Kaepernick, and then before that was Tim Tebow, who was, neither one of them, called a press conference and said, hey, here's what I'm doing, here's who I am, blah, blah, blah.
Of course, they play for private teams. So the issue here, of course, is that we're talking about public institutions.
Right.
That are taxpayer funded. So.
Right. Okay.
Hey, that sort of leads me to this idea that I want to make sure everyone understands. There are three interpretations of the Establishment Clause. Okay, one is no official church, right? That was sort of the original one. Another one was you can't favor certain religions over other religions. And I think that's where a lot of people have sort of found ground here today. And that's the Supreme Court mentions that in this case, this Kennedy case that came out. The third one is the wall of separation, the idea that Thomas Jefferson spoke about, which is that there should be a strict wall between church and state, and that anything that bleeds between that is a violation of the Establishment Clause. So you have these three interpretations of the Establishment Clause that we've had over the centuries, and the wall of separation was very dominant, especially from the 60s all the way up till a few years ago. And now we're starting to see more of this moving into the middle ground, the idea that, well, it's all right if they bleed over between each other, religion and state, just as long as you're not favoring one religion. So some people see that as a step back, some people see that as a step forward.
Sure, I'll use this. I don't know if this is a specific point for the area that I'm trying to argue, but I just would like to bring up how I think it is important to consider. I think you mentioned that it was during the Cold War that a lot of more religious practices started, the wall started to, I don't want to say crumble, but thin. We'll say thin. And obviously that came out of fear, right? Because we didn't want to be communist. And because of that, you had to hold on to this tenuous American identity as hard as possible. And I think it is, in a way, discouraging that we had to rely on a certain set of explicitly Christian moral values in order to do that. And I would like to think, and I think that's part of why I'm sitting here, that we have developed beyond that and that we can agree. I am not one, in religious spaces, the argument gets brought up a lot that you need religion in order to be a moral person. And I don't agree with that. I think we can develop beyond that point. And I think people can use a religion as a basis for their morals. But I think as a collective, maybe I'm an idealist, but I think that we can have a hard moral foundation, not without that, but in agreement that we're all different on that level. And that, so yeah, maybe without that owing things to each other, we can have that moral foundation and that we can find that sort of identity. That's a lot, but there you go.
Go ahead, Egan.
I wrote down, because as we know, I have a hard time remembering things. Okay, so what you brought up about would kneeling and protest be different? I think the line between religious statements and political statements are kind of being thinned, especially for Christians, because in recent periods, Christianity has been threatened, and taking a strong Christian stance can be a political statement. So I don't know how to argue for the position of authority, but I think that especially if a student led the prayer, if, for example, the professor, the coach's son or daughter was to lead the prayer, and that was instructed by the father, but it was a student, it wasn't someone in a position of authority, that could be marked as a political statement instead of a religious one because of the current statements and current rulings about religion and state. So I think that if we are going to ban Christian statements or religious statements on state-sanctioned ground, then political statements shouldn't be allowed as well. And what does that mean about anything anybody can say?
Well, thank you everyone for your time. Unfortunately, we are almost at 1 o'clock. So if people would like to continue having conversations, you're more than welcome to hang out in this area. But before we close, I just want to know if anyone wants to give any closing remarks or any last thoughts real quick from our 3 guests up here.
I think what I said previously can pretty much function as my final thought. So
I don't think it's the government's job to have a hand in how people express themselves religiously, but I think that public institutions need to be aware of the fact that there are multitudes of different religions and cultures that are within their school walls, and they need to be respectful of that in a way that doesn't infringe upon their other students.
I just barely said something. I feel like I'm done.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. Let's give a big hand to Bree, Egan, and Stephen here for their time. And thank Thanks for having the courage to be up here, guys. I think there are still some tacos, so grab some food, and we will have our next Teaching Politics will be November 15th. So in a couple Tuesdays. So.